Welcome to the Film Gamer Podcast, Season 3, Episode 22. This week, to get it out of the way because I realized how close we were, I am going to do my countdown of the weekend box office of the summer start right now, because I realize that since my brother is coming home, and hey, we might get a segment in there. I won't say which brother, it's a surprise. I realize that, he's going to be sleeping in my studio, so I have to, because my studio is the bedroom. It's not an actual studio, sorry to disappoint, but I have to get that down right now, because when am I going to be recording, and where am I going to be recording, and how am I going to be allowed there? This is episode 29 overall. I'm going to make it to 30. That will be episode 23 of the season. And then I think I'll do the finale. But we're into the summer movie season, and we have the first movie out of the gate right now. It's The Fall Guy. This is the first movie since about, 2009, possibly, to be opening the summer and not have it be a Marvel movie. I talked about the Marvel movie weekends briefly with Spider-Man and X-Men in 2002 and 2003, and that's kind of where it started. The very first Spider-Man in 2002. I talked about first 100 million weekend. 2003, X2, $88 million. That's huge. And then, a couple years go by, 2004, not much, 2005, not much. Later on it was, though. And then, just so you know, and I find this very interesting, somebody pointed out that in 2005, the movies that opened, and neither of them opened huge, it was Kingdom of Heaven, which I've written about on the blog about the director's cut of this movie, because so many people talk about it. It's like something that Gen Z found and like rediscovered, because, post Game of Thrones, everybody's like, where's the next sword and sandal epic? Where's the medieval fantasy that I'm looking for? And the director's cut of that cuts the mustard, although it's just kind of okay. Nonetheless, has a lasting filmmaking legacy. You have the House of Wax remake, which was Paris Hilton's screen debut. Jean Colette Serra, who's just kind of like a talented B-movie filmmaker. He recently, he did a Liam Neeson tour, his better Liam Neeson movies of the post-Taken era of Liam Neeson's career. This guy has done, along with the movie Orphan. And he did a House of Wax. So that movie kind of has a legacy, even though it was a poorly reviewed movie. It's like, oh, where was Jared Padalecki from Supernatural and Alicia Cuthbert and Chad Michael Murray in their careers? And it's kind of like a time capsule for that. And then, of course, again, another movie that I've inexplicably mentioned on this podcast, Crash, all opened in 2005. And despite none of them making big money, they all have cinematic legacies of their own, which I just kind of find fascinating. But anyways, 2007, Spider-Man 3 comes out, breaks the opening weekend record. And, 2008, there's Iron Man lifts off, kicking off the MCU. And then, I forget really what comes out in 2009, which is what I'll have to check if I can go to it right here. Let me just look it up. Can I do that? Well, I have to go back 20 years. It's funny how much you forget how much something works, just because, 2005, wasn't that, 10 years ago or something? And the answer is no. It was like, 15 to almost now 20 years ago. But if we're going to go to 2009 and see what the top movie opening that weekend is, it's May 1st, so that would be X-Men Origins Wolverine. See, I knew it even before I looked at it. So, like, going back then to 2000 let's see what came out in 2006, because now I want to see. My mind works so obsessively. In 2006, Mission Impossible 3 opened. So Mission Impossible 3 in 2006, remember, we just had Mission Impossible 7, and they take quite a bit of time between those movies, is the last time that a movie that was a non-Marvel movie opened in theaters. And I remember I went with my brother to see it. We waited 2 weeks after his birthday to go see it. Although, in retrospect, I mean, I know going to the movies is expensive, but my dad could have probably taken me a little bit more to the theater. I don't know. Would have been nice. Nonetheless, Mission Impossible 3, okay movie. I've rewatched it a bunch of times since. But will I rewatch Fall Guy? I got tickets to it on Tuesday, and it came out this weekend. $28 million is how much it made. The expectations were for it earlier on to open to about 38 million. The movie costs about 130 million, which is a lot. And then when you look at the trailer, it honestly doesn't look that great. It's on this one, the reviews and Gosling and Blunt are what's convincing me to go see this movie. And David Leitch, who I call him, the guy on the blog that I listen to calls him David Leitch, and he works in the industry, so I guess I'll listen to him, and it's just weird to get used to because, as I've mentioned before, the society that we're living in now where we read a lot of things but we don't hear a lot of things, so now there's so many like rapid mispronunciations because people have gone through years where they're essentially like reading things to themselves in their own voices, and it like warps their sense of reality. You want to know why people are so radicalized. It's because we're all in our heads all the time because we're just looking at a screen interpreting what comes at us, and we're not interacting enough. So yeah, it's been a while. The industry is changing. The reason that Fall Guy opened on this date because it was originally slated for the March, I think, 2 weeks after maybe Dune Part 2 was because the actors and writers strike double whammy basically froze development of Hollywood's film slate, and Deadpool got delayed. Yes, Deadpool, another Marvel movie, was going to be the one to open because, as I said, you had Iron Man, then you had Iron Man 2 in 2010, then Thor in 2011, and then in 2012, I'm trying to think what it would have been, because it would have been, man, let me just go down memory lane here, because I'm boggles my mind and I can't remember. I've never had to prove it. It's just always been in my head, but it doesn't come to me in my head so much anymore. So of course 2012 was the Avengers. In 2013 you had Iron Man 3. In 2014 you had Amazing Spider-Man 2. In 2015 you had Avengers 2. In 2016, no, what do you no, you had not much. You had, well, oh, wait. This throws me off. Let me go ahead a week because it was the Jungle Book. Captain America Civil War. Yeah. And then 2017, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. In 2018, Avengers Infinity War. And then, of course, 2019, you have Avengers Endgame, and then boom, COVID happens. So, funny enough, the movie that opens is a movie called The Wretched, which I've never heard of, makes $65,000. This is May 2020, okay? So, like, 30 days after everybody's 2 weeks craziness has gone off, and people, like, just have no clear idea of, like, what the heck is going on. So, yeah, so then you have that, and then people are trying to, get acclimatized of like, okay, well, what's opening? And then you have Wrath of Man taking advantage of the stumbling in 2021. Solid movie. One of my favorite Guy Ritchie movies, honestly, because I'm not a big fan of his style. But then in 2022, it's back to business because it's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And then in 2023, last year, you had Guardians of the Galaxy 3. So now, coming back, um, down to earth, you have the Fall Guy. This movie, I've heard costs as high as 150. I'll say 130 because that just seems right. And it shouldn't be more expensive, but the way that overhead is done now with these massive companies, you some filmmaker on Twitter talked about it, or maybe it could have been in the book that I'm reading now by William Goldman, which is odd because that book is from the 1980s, and everything that William Goldman, who won 2 Academy Awards, by the way, for his screenplay, he also wrote The Princess Bride, but he wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and All the President's Men, won 2 Oscars, and he talked about, you know, opening draws and is there really a such thing as A-list star power? And he says no, you know. Talks about Sylvester Stallone, who was big at the time. and he still is in his own way. But he talks about how, you know, Stallone does a Depression era film, it bombs. He tries to do a dramatic film, it bombs. He goes back to do Rocky 3, he gets 10 million. And he's like, I say that's a bargain. And it's just kind of like, what? Like, this guy just said actors are pointless. What's he talking about here? And the truth of it is that he goes on to say the real stars and the real executives know that the movie is the star ultimately, but it's just something that everybody depends on and like goes with because even the actors know it themselves. So, a lot of times when somebody goes to see a movie, like I'll give you Black Adam as an example. That movie opened to 68 million, which is a pretty high number, and The Rock did overtime in terms of promotion on that movie. And it just so happened that the DC universe was in a very weak position at the time. So The Rock was able to basically go behind the scenes and mess with everything, shake the trees because the executives were in a tizzy because they'd had already like one or two bombs at the time and they were trying to compete with Marvel rather than do their own thing, which was ridiculous because they were doing fine on their own, but they're like, we got to beat Marvel. So they like rushed a bunch of their movies out, which like weren't ready. They had no development plan. And then when the no development plan failed, they like scrambled it and tried to fix and tape it together on the fly. Enter the Rock, and he's like, I am Shazam. Who's Shazam? Um, well, there's Shazam, aka Captain Marvel. Bear with me here. There was Captain Marvel, and then through a rights change, became Shazam. Marvel, of course, buys Captain Marvel because it sounds good. And then they keep him as Shazam, who has the power to change into a big guy when he says Shazam, or change back into a 13-year-old kid. And a person who has those same powers, his archenemy, Shazam's archenemy, that movie from 2019, um, is Black Adam, who has the exact same power set. But now he's played by The Rock. Does he look like Black Adam from the comics? No, he's just The Rock, so he's like bald in a gray suit. The whole movie is muck. Hey, and by the way, guess who directed that movie? Jean Colette Serra, who I mentioned earlier, moving his way up from House of Wax because he, works diligently as a director. So they worked together on this movie and later worked together on Jungle Cruise. But because you have a decent director, knows what he's doing, even though he's directing CGI muck that is superhero films, and you have The Rock, they are able to confidently, like, basically hold the comic book universe at gunpoint and make the comic book universe how they want it to be. And because of that, people think, oh, superheroes are in, and The Rock is a movie star. So we'll pay him whatever we want. And then the movie ends up costing an absurd amount of money. And funny enough, it bombs because it still costs too much and it looks like garbage. But in retrospect, if you look at the movies that followed afterwards, which didn't do too well, like it's crazy that there were like 3 or 4 more DC movies after that, including a Shazam sequel, where they just don't meet because The Rock refuses to deal with like a B-list superhero. Like he doesn't care about story integrity or anything like that. And audiences can tell that, so people don't show up for these movies. They're like, what are we waiting for? And then ahead of, DC Comics, who just got elected, is James Gunn, who did Guardians of the Galaxy. And he's like, all future DC movies don't count. So then the audiences don't show up to them. They show up a bit, they try really hard and push the Flash as the finale. It doesn't really work because the main star keeps getting arrested and the movie doesn't even look that great. And then, Aquaman 2 does okay business. Somebody hilariously pointed out it's like it did the perfect amount of business because had it made 10 million less, people would have said it was a flop. Had people made 10 million more, people would have been asking for a sequel. So it made just the right amount that it's like they didn't lose money, but nobody can ask them to make another again. So it's all super phony. So the big question this weekend that people are weirdly losing their minds over is if Ryan Gosling can't bring people in and his movie only makes 28 million, what hope is there for the industry? And it's like, well, first of all, nobody knows who or what the fall guy is. I've spoken to people who were around when the movie was out or TV show that it's based on. In 1981, from 1986, it ran for about 5 seasons. And I asked my grandmother about it. She's never heard of it. I asked my parents about it, and they were like, oh, yeah, Lee Majors, whatever. And it's just so funny because you ask anybody, and they're like, okay, why was this made into a movie? Why wasn't it just a movie about a stunt guy? It's about a stunt guy who dates a girl. She was originally a makeup artist. Emily Blunt signs on. They make her a director. First time female director. That's interesting. That's like their progressive thing because, God forbid, we'd learn about a makeup artist. They have to be a woman in a position of power. But that's okay because it's like, well, that gives them more agency over the plot. That's like an interesting thing. Now, a story that I would actually sign up for is like this dilemma that I've constantly brought up about movies is like people want to see something different. So like I know the initial concept is eye rolling, but like what if it was like a female director and like a female lead star who like hated each other and had a conflict on set? Wouldn't that be a more exciting movie than like a guy who's like a stuntman and like a girl who like can you imagine if it was a movie essentially about like Gina Carano being a problem on set and they still have all the cool stunts and stuff like that, but it's her and then a female director and they don't get along and it's like a love-hate ship and then, somebody goes missing because that's the send-up is that Aaron Taylor Johnson, who's kind of like it's weird to call him an up-and-comer because he was kick-ass and he's kind of tried to people have said that he's going to be James Bond, which tells you he's not going to be James Bond. But anyway, the plot is Aaron Taylor Johnson goes missing. Ryan Gosling, who's the fall guy, aka the guy who falls off the buildings and into a bag, and he's just the stuntman. He's replaceable. He's not the main star. It is up to him to go and track down this missing actor, and he has to become the hero. And meanwhile, there's Emily Blunt, and there's like a bit of a romance in there, so it should work. But the weird thing about this movie is that, A, I saw the trailer, and it didn't look that good. And, there wasn't even a big, romantic glow I saw between Blunt and Gosling about this. But, like, the weird thing is this movie has a perfect storm in its favor because, A, Ryan Gosling, Oscar nominated for Barbie. Emily Blunt, Oppenheimer star, Oscar nominated. This should be like a coronation. Oppenheimer was even from the same studio. And this is a prime release date, as I've mentioned, like a lot of movies have opened big money on here. What went wrong? Did anything go wrong? That's the other thing. Is like, people talk about the dearth of movie stars. Like, I remember as a kid growing up, and it's like Will Smith had a movie, Adam Sandler had a movie, Will Ferrell would occasionally have a movie, Ben Stiller, and, a lot of them have faded away. You still have your Will Smiths, your Tom Cruise. Occasionally Harrison Ford flexes his muscle, which is amazing to me because he's like 70. The fact that he's been able to carefully craft his career in a way that makes you kind of go, oh, like Harrison Ford has like the most amount of $100 million movies next to Samuel L. Jackson, who just happens to star in them. Tom Hanks, who's the America's national treasure, and Tom Cruise, who's like the blockbuster man. Harrison Ford is like in their company, really? And it's like, I knew he was big in the 80s and 90s, but then you're like, Fugitive, he's been in a bunch of these movies, and then he goes back to, Star Wars, and it kind of leads The Force Awakens, so yeah, it's impressive. Of course, Disney wants to be in business with Harrison Ford, and he remains an icon, and he's like one of the main roles next year in Captain America Brave New World. Like, he's like sort of the main villain here. So it's impressive how Harrison Ford has crafted his career. But he belongs to an era where there were A-listers, and you don't have that anymore. Like, Gosling and Blunt is actually, technically, you run the numbers, she's actually a bigger star than Ryan Gosling. People kind of forget because Ryan Gosling took us all by storm with Barbie and La La Land and stuff. But those are like Oscar movies, okay? Like, Ryan Gosling was like the Oscar guy. The only difference now is that he has kids to feed, so he's doing stuff like The Gray Man. He's doing stuff like Barbie, and he's doing stuff like The Fall Guy because he's like, let me take a big check and like do this blockbuster movie. And he's good at it because like you look at Drive, and as they say, it's like the secret to Ryan Gosling is that he's actually a good actor. Remember, there was a time when people didn't think so. He was just a pretty face. He was like the cornerback in Remember the Titans came out in the year 2000. He dated Sandra Bullock in Murder by Numbers. Terrible movie, by the way. But, some good 2000s era movie making sensibilities of like, this kind of isn't a big deal. It's the thrill of the week, but let's make it nice and have fun with it. Anyway, terrible film, Murder by Numbers. Wouldn't recommend it. But back in that time, he like was working his way up, and then he does The Notebook, and then he does Fracture, and then he kind of does Crazy Stupid Love, and then he does The Big Short, and it's like all of these are like critically acclaimed films where he's starring opposite better actors, so he's like building up his resume dramatically, and but like isn't Oscar nominated until he plays a drug addict, like most people, most actors in Hollywood. Most people don't get to play drug addicts on screen. Far too many people are real drug addicts. But anyways, he does the Oscar thing, and then he's, in Blade Runner 2049, a big production flop of a movie, makes $32 million. And then he does Barbie, and that's huge. And of course, people go, well, then of course, in the sexist minds of Hollywood executives, Ryan Gosling is the draw power. And it's like, okay, like for the last 10 years, and we're counting 10, like what's Emily Blunt been in? I'm gonna recall this off the top of my head, see if I can do it without checking, because she has been in like kind of major movies that have been like major successes. Like her first major movie that like anybody saw her in was The Devil Wears Prada. That movie opened opposite Superman Returns. Superman Returns made 52 million that weekend. The Devil Wears Prada made 27 million. And you're like, oh, well, that's Meryl Streep, that's Anne Hathaway, who aren't draws, by the way. That was just a very incredibly well marketed film, I think by 20th Century Fox. And it's like, oh, well, that's not her. And you'd be right. She just happens to be in the movie. Newsflash, that's everybody. Like, you take any Tom Cruise movie and you put any able-bodied guy in it, the truth is that it would probably do well. It's Tom Cruise, because he's gathered a particular set of skills over a very long career. He's able to call in favors. He has connections. He has relationships that make people trust him. But the fact of the matter is, again, the movie is the star. So it's like, oh, they just happen to be in a good movie. It's like, yeah, that's everyone. So Emily Blunt is in The Devil Wears Prada. And then she's in The Adjustment Bureau. That's another movie, again, with Matt Damon, that was like a surprise hit. Okay? Did people, I guess, in the realm, this was in 2011, March, saw it in theaters with my buddy Eric, shout out to Eric, and it was like, everybody who reviewed this movie at the time was like, well, this movie I thought was going to suck, but was surprisingly good, and it's like, you're going to see a movie that you think is going to suck? Like, what's wrong with you? I'd never waste my time on that. But anyways, decent film, really could have been, with a few more adjustments, great, but nonetheless is like a hit. She kind of steals a few scenes in like Dan in Real Life, which was just like at the time when those indies were like at their most popular, as like a local movie rental type hit. And then 2014, who does she star opposite? Tom Cruise, Edge of Tomorrow, great. That's like Tom Cruise's best movie of the last like 10 years. I kid you not. Aside from, you could go to bat for one of the Mission Impossibles, and of course Top Gun Maverick is amazing. Tom Cruise's performance in it notwithstanding, but she's in that, and she like owns that movie. That is like a major role for her. And then you're like, what else was she? She was in Mary Poppins. That was like made $180 million. Now, of course, nobody remembers it because it was directed by Rob Marshall, who's the king of making forgettable, successful movies. He did Pirates of the Caribbean 4 on Stranger Tides, which is like an adaptation of like a classic novel. And what does he do with the material? F all. I bet you, when was the last time you thought about Pirates of the Caribbean 4 until I mentioned it right now? The answer is you haven't. And another one of those movies that she worked with Rob Marshall on was Into the Woods, a Broadway adaptation. It starred Johnny Depp. It starred Anna Kendrick. It starred Chris Pine. It starred all of these people. Again, $100 million hit. I saw it in theaters. I reviewed it myself, and I like forgot that I reviewed it because this guy makes such forgettable films. Those are like three or four major movies. I'm not even done yet. Emily Blunt, who also hasn't starred in a Marvel movie. Do you know how hard it is to become an A-list actor and not star in a Marvel movie to like get there, which is what most of them have done now. And people haven't noticed. Like Adam Sandler used to do like Click. Will Smith would go and play Hitch, like Tom Cruise would be a hitman in Collateral. They would all do well. But like people don't make those movies anymore because they're too much of a risk in the social media era. If a movie like that is a flop, people kind of go, ugh. So the trick is to kind of be like The Rock and make a movie that's intentionally bad so that people lower their expectations for it and be like, wow, I wasn't expecting it to be good anyway. It's a triumph over low expectations is the Hollywood era. But anyways, Emily Blunt starred with The Rock and Jungle Cruise. That movie opened to 35 million and it opened on streaming at the same time. Like she was in that. She has been in way more successful $100 million movies than Ryan Gosling. But you ask any studio executive, I bet you Ryan Gosling was paid more because he's a man. And it's annoying to me, not as even as any kind of like ultra feminist, I'm feminist on this podcast, but like thing, it's just like math and averages. This person is like consistently in better movies, chooses better roles, and is in movies that have made more money. If The Fall Guy had actually been built around Emily Blunt more, the movie actually would have done better because they're like, okay, what is this like action comedy about a female director? Instead, if you look at all the trailers for The Fall Guy, they are all built around Emily Blunt in relation to Gosling. And it's like, yeah, that's cool. Like, that's one angle. Ryan Gosling doing the, drive thing. He's a stuntman. Also, my second favorite movie of 2011 behind Contagion. But like, the thing is that people don't realize about Gosling is that he, in all the movies that he's good in, the successful ones have been built around a stronger female actress, which is why his career is the way it is. Breakout, Notebook. Who was the main star in that movie? Rachel McAdams. It's hard to believe, but yeah, 2004. That's where it was. And then she also did, Mean Girls that year. Okay. And then you think, La La Land. Well, that was Emma Stone. That was like Emma Stone's movie of like she was the actress and he was the guy on the side doing like the jazz thing. And it's like, oh yeah, it's like Ryan Gosling is the secondary surprise in a movie. People confuse him with Ryan Reynolds. In fact, Rachel McAdams did a joke at the MTV Movie Awards, which, of course, as we all know, is the best award show. I seriously recommend anybody go back and look at clips on YouTube of the MTV Movie Awards. One of them is Rachel McAdams making it with Ryan, hold your horses, Reynolds. And she's like, I kissed the wrong Ryan, as like a joke because it was after the year of the Notebook and stuff like that. It's kind of funny though. So like Ryan Gosling in the Notebook, female hit. La La Land, female hit. Crazy Stupid Love, also starring an ensemble cast of like Steve Carell and whatnot, but also Emma Stone, female hit. Like Barbie was Barbie marketed around Ken? Yeah, partially. As like an ironic joke, but always in relation to Barbie. So it was a fundamental misunderstanding from the people who were marketing The Fall Guy of like, what is the appeal of this movie? And their idea was like, oh, Ryan Gosling, and they hung it all on him. And then now the movie, when it makes 28 million, which by the way is only 2 million less than Bullet Train, the director's last movie. Okay, so it's pretty much in line with that. And people are like, oh, lowered expectations, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, the marketing sucked for one because it's a spring movie that came out in May, but that's fine because it's an open weekend. I talked it's a great release date. Okay. But like the other problem is just that this movie felt like a little try hard. Like the main thing that gets me about this movie is, and I have hangups about every single movie. Okay. I'm still going to see this one because I like original action movies. You know this. But like, if you look at the trailer of Fall Guy, the two things stick out to me. One is the shot of him skating on a piece of metal on the back of a truck and stuff, and sparks are flying. It's a terrible looking effect shot, awful looking effect shot. That effect shot says, "Oh yeah, didn't I see The Gray Man on Netflix last summer or 2 summers ago that Gosling was in? Why don't I just wait for this on Netflix?" Like that is the kind of shot. If you're going to the big leagues and you're making $100 million movie, it has no excuse to look like shit. So I'm sorry, David Leitch. Um, it like you had to sign off on that shot, and you said good enough. And I know most of your movies you're like a practical stunt guy, but like Hobbs and Shaw sort of had okay effects. There's a lot of effects in Deadpool 2 that you previously direct that weren't good. There's some questionable things in Bullet Train, but the expectations weren't high for that because that movie came out and had zero competition. Like that was part of the Black Adam year that I just spoke about, where there was essentially Bullet Train came out at the beginning of August, end of July, and there was nothing, no blockbuster movie until Black Adam, which was kind of interesting because then you had things like The Woman King come out and, other surprises, which always happens when there's nothing out. It's like you give the opportunity for something to break out. But yeah, this movie visually, for a movie that costs over 100 million, and again we've heard reports as high as 150 million, that it looked like a streaming product. Like this is something that Netflix would do. You want to know why Godzilla X Kong, which beat all my expectations, did so well? It's because people looked at that and they're like, this looks amazing. Like this looks so photorealistic. I've never seen anything better. Holy crap, this is why we go to the movies. And I kind of take that for granted because I know how good effects can be, so I know what to look for. And when something is impressive, like the last movie that impressed me special effects wise was Ready Player One. But like, let me tell you, I got a phone call from my dad's friend, and was talking to me. He's like, "We saw Godzilla X Kong. My 12-year-old like loved it. He could not believe it. He wants to see it again." And I remember seeing Godzilla versus Kong in 2021. Again, it was on streaming because Warner Brothers made the brave decision of like, okay, we're still going to release all of our movies in theaters, but also streaming at the same time. Pissed everybody off, but honestly, got the movies getting released again, which I'm thankful for them. Again, I love it when movies come out in theaters, but I'm not one of those weird save the theaters people because why am I, pumping an industry that charges me a ridiculous amount for popcorn? Like, it's like $10 for popcorn. Like, what the F is that about? What a terrible business plan. But when something is done well, like visual effects, it adds an immense amount of value to the film. It says people actually worked on this. And when movies lean on effects like they do now, that's more important than ever. So that was the one thing. And then the second thing is a scene of them trying to have like a comedy moment of like Ryan Gosling crying in the car to himself, watching it, like listening to Taylor Swift. And of course, there's like the awkward knock at the window by Emily Blunt being like, "Are you listening to Taylor Swift?" Like it's an unpopular thing. I'm sorry, but like the movie missed the moment. Like, did like did you not know that Taylor Swift is like unabashedly popular now? Like you have Kevin Costner going to Taylor Swift concerts and just kind of without reason. Like I'm sure he took his daughter or somebody there, but it's like Taylor Swift is kind of cool for everybody. And then Gosling, who was just in Barbie, it's like, yeah, it's cool to be vulnerable and be like we've been on this for like literally the past 4 years and done like nothing else. So is it like awkward? No, because she's crashing, he's crying in the car on his own. And then it's like, is it funny because it's like an unexpected song you would expect him to listen to? No, because All Too Well, like, re-entered the Billboard charts like 2 years ago and was like the number one hit song. It's like, oh my gosh, you're listening to American Pie? What kind of song is that? It's like saying that, try saying that to a boomer. It's like obvious, so it's my point is that the movie kind of has a distinct lack of identity for a movie that kind of hangs itself on like a reason to go see this movie is because it's about movies and this is why we go see something. But if you have no identity of your own, then like it's like the one guy who has no opinion and just picks everyone else's opinion, why would you expect anybody to want to listen to what he has to say? And it's just kind of like this weird space of identity that this movie has, where it's kind of trying to be a movie about everything, a four quadrant movie. It's not too violent that, you can't sneak a kid to it. It has a bit of romance, it has a bit of action, it has everything, but people aren't seeing it. Now, I presume that my brother, who just texted me about it, he's like, it felt a little too long, but glad it was a movie. I think they did as well as they could, but the soundtrack era is at odds with the contemporary nature. Yeah, that was the thing. When you watch the trailer for The Fall Guy, it's "You Give Love a Bad Name" by Bon Jovi. Like, holy crap, what a terrible song to pick. Like, that's like an obvious song that's been beaten to death. Like, absolutely no taste. And the Taylor Swift thing kind of confirms it, because it's like all over the place. Like, clearly they added that song last minute in post. And if you watch Anyone But You, it's like the same thing of like, did they decide on this song last minute? Because it's like you could literally pick and pull this. Keep in mind, this is a Universal picture. Universal Music Group is the largest music group in the world. They could literally get music from any movie. Like, they could get Led Zeppelin. They could call up Sony and get like Michael Jackson. Like, there is no song that's off limits. And it's like, yeah, let me go with Bon Jovi. Like, and it's not even Living on a Prayer. Like, so, and it's not even thematically important. The key is to pick a song in your movie that won't be anywhere else, that could only be used here to tell this story. And if you can pluck it and just put something else in, you know, that doesn't make any sense. Anyone But You's was successful for Natasha Bedingfield's Unwritten because A, that director has pulled that move with Easy A and Pocket Full of Sunshine, but B, because it feels like a song that people that age would listen to, and also it's like, oh, it's his Serenity song and stuff, and they hang two scenes on it, so it works that way. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Um, my brother ends with, oh, man, I am totally off. My brother Sam saw The Fall Guy this last weekend. Said it was good. Wait, he's texting me now. Isn't The Fall Guy? It's Turtles All the Way Down, which was a streaming movie that was dumped on streaming. Um, and like I said to him, "Oh, this movie was like dumped on streaming after being like talked about for years. They just like kind of made it and released it without releasing it in theaters, which by the way, most of the time if you haven't realized, a streaming movie that could have gone to theaters but didn't is because it didn't test well enough to go to theaters and they didn't think it was worth the money. So that's why a movie usually isn't in theaters, unless it's an awards fair for like Netflix and they're like, okay, let us buy this and it'll win us Oscars. But if an action movie was like good enough, or a romance movie was like good enough or tested high enough, then it would be in theaters. And that's why Anyone But You was there, because it tested high enough. So he's talking about Turtles All the Way Down, adapted from the John Green book. John Green, who did and wrote Fault in Our Stars, huge 20th Century Fox hit, like in 2014. In fact, the movie that it beat at the box office was Edge of Tomorrow, another good movie. But yeah. Um, anyways, I'll get to and review Turtles All the Way Down, I guess, at some point, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll totally forget that I'm talking about it now. Number two, Star Wars Day yesterday. Today's Revenge of the Fifth. So, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, was re released for like the third time. And what's amazing to me is that I'm writing a piece on putting together my Star Wars experience. I didn't see this one in theaters. I have no desire to see movies in theaters that I've already seen on video. Except for that one time I went to see it at TIFF because it'd been a while and my brother, we needed something to go see. So, Phantom Menace, re-released in 2,700 theaters, makes 8 million. This movie has been re-released 3 times. Why people keep going to see these movies, I have no idea. So this movie making 8 million when it's on Disney Plus right now, and is also not a good movie, is something else. Like, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, has overall, if I can go here, like it has made $482 million in North America, over $1 billion worldwide. Like, in its original release, it made like 430, but when it came out in 3D, it made about like 43 million, like open to 20 million, which is like, as I said, opening to 20 million. That's like something. And then like the other thing was that they also re-released it in like 2021 and stuff, like minimally in Australia. But like it came out in 99 and then they released it in 2012 in 3D and then made it again. So it's like, wow, a half hour of people sitting in semicircles, trade disputes. How exciting, you know? Now, the thing Star Wars has going for it is the effects, and they were great in 1999. By the time they were using the same effects in Revenge of the Sith in 2005, it's like, what is this? This looks like a video game and in a bad way. But George Lucas, true to his, 4D chess style, suggested, and he's actually right about it, is like the point of the effects is not the realism of the rendering. It is with the imagination of something that you've never seen before. That's what matters most to like transport you and like grab your attention and spark your imagination is equally as important as being like realistic. So George just went the other way on that. Number three is Challengers, which, how much did this drop? About half. Okay, we'll see how it goes. It's about 30 million, 50 million worldwide. Remember, it cost 55 and part of a two-picture deal with Amazon. So it's like this could lose money. It doesn't matter. Like the way backwards way which movies are released like this now is like this is all basically a primer for when it comes out on streaming service and breaks all the records, which it will do because it's a movie that people actually want to see and they know they want to see it because it came out in theaters because it was good enough to come out in theaters and worth investing in. And, people do and talk about it, and it has a moment referenced on SNL, which was the lamest skit, by the way, last night. The Dua Lipa hosted episode and musical episode, you can skip that, except her performances were good musical performances. But, like, they have a Challenger skit on that. And again, another universal property. They own everything in media. Um, they don't release like they don't even use the actual Challengers music. But like it's like the writers heard that Gen Z was listening to the soundtrack, which is by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails and Atticus Ross, who have won two Oscars for The Social Network and Pixar's Soul. They're very good composers, so they made a good score that people are listening to. I know a lot of people listen to the Social Network soundtrack, which, by the way, beat Hans Zimmer's Inception score for best score. I get it, but I like the Inception score way better. Um, anyways, so they have a good score. They have a lot of good pieces of this movie. It's made with some degree of quality, so people want to see it. So when it comes out, people will um, watch it on Amazon Prime. It'll, drive a lot of ads, I'm guessing, and people will go taking all the wrong lessons from it. It's like, oh, Zendaya is box office gold, the director can't miss, all these things. And it's like, no, they just spent a decent amount of money on this movie and tried to make a movie that wasn't trying to sell you something. Although, that's kind of short sighted. I haven't seen the movie, but I hear there's a lot of merchandising in it. But it makes sense because it takes place in the tennis world. I mean, they chose Adidas, and I personally like Adidas better than Nike, so that's my bias. Number four is Tarot. This is from Sony, and it's a horror movie. And like most Sony movies, particularly by Screen Gems, it is not good. The reviews for it are terrible, but it's a horror movie, so you put a decent horror movie out, and decent in terms of the level of production and presentation they put into marketing this movie, which was still minimal, but horror, super low floor, limitless ceiling. Like if you decide tomorrow that you want to be a filmmaker, if you make a horror movie, it does not matter how terrible it is. Like people will watch it. Like the most dedicated, positive group of people in the world in terms of film are movie fans. You talk to any destitute producer, they're like, "What are you making?" They're like, "If you make horror, we will make it." It's just I don't have a horrific mind. I'm like basic. So the best thing I can come up with is like Friday the 13th knockoff, but we'll see. And that movie made 6 million. I don't know how much it made overall, but it probably cost less than that. Is it even going to say? No. Um, Now I want to see, because I always go to Wikipedia. I don't trust any other source, um, because Wikipedia, just the way that it's organized and what it draws from, is all the usual stuff I look at. So let's see here. Tarot 2024 horror film. Who directed it? The answer, who cares? Who produced it? Who cares? Nobody cares, and not even horror. So this movie cost 8 million. Has already made six, made 10 million worldwide. There's your money back. Dog doo doo reviews, but it doesn't matter. People want to be scared. They want to go see something. A horror movie, you can always guarantee, aside from the A24 horror movies, that something is going to happen in the movie. Like somebody's going to die, and that communicates urgency. It communicates immediacy. It's a very easy plot to understand. The danger is apparent. So, like, that's why horror movies work. Number 5, Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire. 188 million. Is it over 500? Yes, 546. Yeah, it's made a lot of money. Good special effects, folks. Number 6, Civil War. Dropped about half. Okay, it's the beginning of, the summer movie season. Heavy competition. 62 million domestically. It's already made its budget back domestically, so it's a hit. But it hasn't gotten to the overall box office narrative of like 100 million worldwide guaranteed hit, like thing. But I'm telling you, like, ahead of time, like, yes, this movie is a hit already. Like, it didn't open huge, but it opened pretty good. And like, the time is set where it's like, yeah, this movie is like a pretty well defined hit. um I can't wait for the people who should see the movie, like the prime audience of the movie, because this had a really good marketing campaign, and people went to see it who wouldn't normally go see a movie. But they're still not the main people. You kind of have to wait for the idiots to discover this movie and then tell you about it. And then you can be like, I already know, I listened to the Film Gamer podcast, but thank you. Of like, oh, have you heard about this movie, Civil War? It's like, yeah, and it's good. But yeah, on its way to 100 million worldwide. And then we can just, unsung hero. This movie came out like last weekend. It's like a Lionsgate Christian film, made 13 million. I saw somebody on Twitter be like, I saw it in theaters, changed my life, best movie of the year, and good for the people who think that. Will I ever see it? Probably not. But, hey, if this ever takes off, this podcast, I'll see anything if the fans tell me to. Kung Fu Panda 4, yeah, they phoned it in because they knew they could do another. Who cares how much? It made money. Abigail, the 30 million vampire movie, which was about people wandering around a house. Shocker, third Dracula movie for Universal in a year. What do I tell you? Bombs. It'll do well on home video. And then Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, 109 mil. Does okay worldwide, pushing to 200 million. It's just, again, a movie where it's like they're chained to like a franchise, and it's like, imagine if they made a movie about Ghostbusters and it wasn't a Ghostbusters film. It was about people just trying to bust ghosts, but none of the rules of Ghostbusters applied, so it didn't have to be funny, or the other way, like it didn't have to be scary. Like, can you just imagine, like, if you take, oh yeah, there's a crap load of ghosts loose in Manhattan, so now these kids and like strangers have to team up to get them, and it has like $100 million budget. Like, imagine if it was just like a ghost fighting movie that you didn't know about. Like, that's more appealing to me than like Ghostbusters 5, a franchise which should be funny. Like, I saw the animated thing as a kid and thought, oh, this would be really cool, and then, you know, it's one of those weird franchises where you're like, shouldn't its best movie be better than this? But hey, what can I say? The Ghostbusters, due to its Laserdisc release, is in the Criterion collection. So, who's complaining about quality there? And there's no, like, there's two movies that are like in the indie space. I saw the TV Glow, which is the A24 movie of the month, made 29,000 per theater. It's about a guy and a girl who like reunite after seeing something on TV together. Now, it being 2024, I'm curious, will the guy and the girl be in a romantic relationship? they're millennials and Gen Z, so probably not. But like nonetheless, it will be seen by its audience. I have no doubt about that. And then number 24 is Wildcat. This is Ethan Hawke's like directorial fictional narrative debut, I guess. Um, at least for a movie that I don't think he stars in. His and Uma Thurman's daughter, is in it, Maya Hawke, and she plays a historical figure. Flannery O'Connor follows the life of her while she struggles to publish her first novel. Um, Good for them. It premiered at TIFF, and I kind of joked with my mom about like running into Ethan Hawke because she likes Ethan Hawke now. Used to irritate, but now he's found his vibe. So I joked with her. It's like, well, Maya Hawke is my age, and it's like, imagine if I ran into them at Toronto. And like when I told my mom that I actually had the opportunity to go see this movie, she's like, "What? You weren't joking? Like you can actually go? Could have gone and actually met them and seen the movie?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but I didn't want to spend the $50 on the ticket because, I'm cheap." No, I wouldn't say I'm cheap. It's just like if I had a job, then I'd pay for like the landmark cinemas, whatever, and then go see this stuff, and I could afford to spend money on like interesting opportunities. But yeah, I don't have that now. And then I'm just gonna mention this as a cursory, a movie called Evil Does Not Exist. I'll give you the plot description. Takumi and his daughter Hannah live in Mizubiki Village, close to Tokyo. One day, the village inhabitants become aware of a plan to build a camping site near Takumi's house, offering city residents a comfortable escape, quote unquote, to nature. I don't know anything about the genre other than it being listed as a drama, but I will tell you it is released by the oldest filmmaking studio in the world in history, Yanis Films, which goes back, I swear to gosh, they were founded in what, 1898? Let's see here. Like, it'd be an honor to work with them just because respect to the game. They've been in it longer than anyone else. It's just kind of shocking that they're not like bigger with all their head start and stuff like that. But they're an American film distributor. Like to go back, they like made and released. They released The Seventh Seal in 1957, and they're a private company. So there you go. Like they bring in like only 6 million a year. What? No, that can't be right. They weren't founded in 1956. That's got to be, well, then who the heck am I thinking of? Like 1956, da 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 da. Like, no way. Man, there's somebody else that I got to be thinking of then. Like, if we go back to the invention of film, like movie theater, like a business auditorium, Nickelodeon, blah 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 blah. Like, what? Like, what was the first movie? Like, cause I swear, I'm hate to say it, but I'm having like a Mandela effect here of like, isn't the very first like major movie like Studio Yanis Films? Um, cause I want to go back to like, you know, theater, opera and stuff like that, like Thomas Edison inventing the kinetoscope and stuff. Yeah, it's like in the 1980s and stuff. Like, what was the first movie? Yeah, this is bothering me. And I know I'm not gonna find it. I just want to look here. Bear with me here. Yeah, stadium seating, blah blah blah. Skip to this. The problem with this is that like it's like the original six. If you don't know in hockey, like there's this idea of like the original six. The original six doesn't actually exist as we know it, but people think that when hockey became popular, there were six major NHL teams. But Toronto Maple Leafs, Boston being one of them, Montreal Canadiens, um, and I forget who the others were. And so I'm not going to name them incorrectly. I'll say something like New York Rangers, and I might be wrong and stuff. But that there were like six major hockey teams to start out. This was never actually the case, and they all actually had different names, and then it's like, well, the actual league started earlier or later. Stuff. It's one of those situations where um, a good example in the industry is like MGM. MGM today does not exist as we know it. In video games, Atari does not exist today as we knew it then when like the first video game console was released. They're just a name, a company in name only. Like Sega, who made Sonic the Hedgehog and made the Sega Genesis, doesn't exist as we know it. They're a gambling machine company, like who like licensed their name as a publisher to someone else. It's one of those weird capitalism situations. So yeah, it's something for another time. If you want me to delve into the history of it all, maybe I will. But that concludes our box office. It's a slow weekend, and next weekend is Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which I'm sure will be fine. The director of it did The Maze Runner, which has an interesting first movie, a not great second, and a terrible third. And this is the director's next film. Now, he's working with really high end tools because this was one of the franchises, oddly, that Disney was most interested in when they were buying 20th Century Fox, this and Alien. So it's taken them 4 years to come out with these two kind of mid movies, which any brilliant person would turn into an event film because if they're, imagine the first Alien is so iconic. Like, can you imagine having the tools to, like, yeah, we can make a movie as great as that again if we put, like, an A level film in it? Instead, they pick, like, the B level director, like, B plus level, because Don't Breathe is great. But Alvarez, like, he was chosen by Sony to do The Girl in the Spider's Web because David Fincher was too expensive, okay? And I like the movie that he did, but it was like B plus level, okay? And then Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. The guy who did that went on to do the Batman, a movie I don't like, but the director is like really talented. He also did Cloverfield, was like his first movie, a movie that like captured everybody's imagination. So like following up his films with like the guy who did Don't Breathe, it's like I get it, tonally dark, edgy thriller genre picture. It works, but it's like you're taking that and then it's like, oh yeah, let me get the director of the Maze Runner, futuristic dystopian. I kind of get it. It's like that. So it's you know working with the tools, I'm sure that Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes will be fine. Like the special effects will be fine. The storytelling will be at least rote or competent. But like it could have been like a game changer. Like the original Planet of the Apes was a game changer. I can't even like I wasn't around then. I haven't seen it even. But like remember I remember when the Tim Burton version was coming out in 2001. That was like a big movie. Like I went to the theaters to go see that and Fast and the Furious. My dad took me and he got there and he realized that it wasn't playing. It was like on one screen it was Planet of the Apes and Dr. Dolittle 2 and on the other was Jurassic Park and Fast and the Furious, which was a Universal and one was the Fox thing. So, the drive-in bundled two movies together back when they would not skip 4 months between movies like Disney does now. So and it's just so funny to me that it's like Disney's first major movie this year was the first Omen, a Fox movie. Its next movie is Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, a Fox movie. Its next movie is The Young Woman in the Sea, a Fox movie, or it could be like inspirational sports Disney. So, yeah. And then it also has Deadpool, which is not a Marvel movie, it's a Fox movie with the Marvel property attached. And then it has Alien coming out, a Fox movie. And then what Disney movies does it have coming out? The Young Woman in the Sea, and Inside Out 2. And those are the only, like, Disney movies. This is a company that owns two AAA movies, ate another studio, and the studio it has eaten has come out with more movies than it has, despite being, you know, half the size. But they do have a studio lot, so there it is. Maybe that's why they can argue. The inner workings of studios are, like, so fascinating to me. I mean, I've gone on as of this podcast right now, we do have, Paramount possibly being taken over by Skydance Media Group, which is made partially from the bones of the rejected guy who was fired from Disney for being too handsy, mixed with the guy who does Mission Impossible and who is the son of a billionaire, Larry Ellison, who runs Oracle, which is a tech company that basically blocked me and you out of going to see whatever website we wanted to in high school because Fort Guard Security was created by Oracle. So, a tech company that's been around longer than you and his enterprise. So, yeah, you know, they have access to a lot of money. They're trying to buy Paramount, of course, being cheap like most companies, they're not giving them a good offer. So it's kicking between them and Sony and another private equity group to buy Paramount. If Sony buys Paramount, it's another Disney Fox situation where it's like they'll combine, they'll be way more conservative, and when you're conservative, you take less risks, so there'll be less people in Hollywood to sell to. Basically, a nightmare. Sherry Redstone, the CEO of Paramount, understands this and doesn't want it to happen, but we'll just have to wait and see. So, yeah. What is my subject for this week? Good question. It was Hollywood contracts. The thing that I wanted to talk about that I did in my first take was the Indiana Jones movies and just the subject of course, it being Spielberg, he handles it better than most, but contracts are the lifeblood of Hollywood, and if you sign a bad one, it can really ruin you and damage your company. If you sign a great one, it's great. Um, Let me give you an example. Great contract. Robert Downey Jr. signing for the Avengers. Disney and Marvel, famously cheap companies. Cheap labor. That's how they get it. Um, they signed Robert Downey Jr., but he was a bit of a risk. So they're like, okay, if this takes off, but he doesn't, we got to be able to jettison this guy. So let's not sign him for another movie. Of course, he ends up being the sole responsibility for Iron Man's success, and he's great in the movie. And then by the time the Avengers rolls around, he's done two Iron Man movies. So his contract has to be renegotiated. So they're like, shoot, these movies are not just 100 million, but $300 million hits. We have to renegotiate with him. And Robert Downey Jr. has had his fair share of legal trouble and has found his way back to being a hit. So he's used his lawyers before. So he leads a renegotiation of all of the main Avengers stars cast payouts, and he gets for himself $50 million on Avengers, which is insane. But one of the highest grossing movies of all time, and he's leading it, so that's what he gets. That's a good contract for him. Who was it a bad contract for? Terrence Howard, who in 2008 was on the come up. He was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Lead Actor. He was the highest paid person. Again, Marvel being very cheap on Iron Man. He was the highest paid person. And what do they do after the first Iron Man? Is basically he doesn't, nobody on Iron Man really has any deal. Gwyneth Paltrow, she's kind of an I don't want to. She's a nepo baby, so she's kind of secure no matter what. You tell her to go, it's like, oh, do I want to do that? Yeah, sure, whatever. But she doesn't have to pay attention as much, and that really helps you in Hollywood if you can if you're not desperate. So she stays on board. Terrence Howard has agents who decide that he is hot shit and they can play hardball with him. And what happens is, them being the cheap bastards that they are, sorry for the language, they take what he was paid on the first Iron Man, Terrence Howard, and pay him less in order to pay Robert Downey Jr. more. And they give him a revised lower offer, which is awful. Say what you will about Terrence Howard, but that's that's cruel. Or not cruel, but it's wrong just to do when the first movie was a hit and you're paying somebody less to pay someone else more. And it's basically a history of Hollywood of pitting men against women. In 2017, Mark Wahlberg and Michelle Williams worked for the same agency on All the Money in the World. Mark Wahlberg is like the third most important actor in that movie, isn't in it as much. It's Michelle Williams' movie. Who do you think they pay more? Mark Wahlberg by 10 times more. And it's Mark Wahlberg again, as I brought up. It's like Stallone doing the Depression era drama movie. Like, it's not an action movie. It's not Transformers, which again he was in, but we kind of forget because those movies weren't good. But he got paid 10 times more to be in that movie. It gets found out. Keep in mind, this is November 2017. Kevin Spacey has just been fired on this movie. When it's found out that they work for the same agency, they have the same agents, and Mark Wahlberg was paying 10 times more because he asked for more, that's industry sexism. Because Michelle Williams, say what you will about box office draws and all that, like anchors that movie. So in principle, she should be paid more because she does more work. So, you know, as for it, it's like, oh yeah, Mark Wahlberg got that much. Yeah, the agency knew that movie was a flop. I did take my family to see it in theaters because there wasn't much going on, and my mother did not want to see Jumanji. And, I kind of don't blame her, even though it ended up being good. But yeah, there wasn't oddly a lot to see in theaters at that time. That was a boring movie. Ridley Scott has quite a few of them. David Scarpa wrote it, so of course that Napoleon, unfortunately Gladiator 2, two of those turn out to be boring, and we just have to wait for Gladiator 2 and its live sharks. Hopefully the script won't matter too much. But like, yeah, boring dramatic movie makes no money. But like at the time, Wahlberg was able to negotiate a huge salary because, you know, it doesn't matter. And like he had the leverage. So, yeah. I'm surprised how much I'm talking about industry sexism here. And again, I don't like lead with this kind of stuff. I'm not trying to like prove a point to you. I don't need to prove to you that like the industry is unfair to women. It's just evident in like what I come across. So like, feel free to shout me about like, oh, well, you got this wrong or this isn't wrong. But yeah, most people never do because I'm right most of the time. And when I encounter somebody who does know as much as me, we're usually talking about the same thing, or I know a bit about one thing, or they know something super specific. And I'm just, I'm not challenged because I kind of like frequently check my own work. And I also, talk about only what I know about. So, if you want to make me uncomfortable, suggest me to talk about a topic that I don't know about, but interest people, and then, spark controversy, and then it'll be popular, and then, I'll have to be backed into my corner and sow my oats then. But as for now, it's wrong the way Hollywood is very mercenary about contracts. Terrence Howard plays hardball. It's like, I do not deserve less than I was paid on the last movie when the first movie was such a big hit. Like, you're screwing me. So the directors are like, we got the leverage here. Don't worry about it. They just go ahead and cast Don Cheadle. They're like, we can sub another brother out. It doesn't matter, you know? And I remember seeing it in theaters with my sister and her boyfriend at the time. And he's like, hey, I like Don Cheadle. It's just weird not having Terrence Howard there. And I still think about it for a while. Like, Don Cheadle just kind of feels wrong for that role. And he's kind of a bit of a scab, but like it turned out well for him because he's paid handsomely to just sit there and be quiet. And then he even got an Emmy win. But like, hey, it got security. Don Cheadle, by the way, is like weird because he's frequently cast as a serious actor, but he seems like a good-natured, funny guy. Like, why is he told there to be, a no-nonsense character? Like, you need somebody who can kind of play and be like anytime, and you have to look for them. Like, anytime Don Cheadle is like even sort of goofy, he's immediately better. Like, the best Don Cheadle role there is his cameo in Rush Hour 2, where he comes up super serious and then he breaks character and is like with Chris Tucker, like they're joking, and then it turns out that he has a better rapport with Jackie Chan than he does Chris Tucker, and Chris Tucker feels left out. But like, yeah, Rush Hour 2, good movie. Don Cheadle, great. He's great in that movie because he's funny, but he has this weird reputation as somebody who's like, oh, I'm the serious guy. He has a serious face, I guess that's why, and works with Steven Soderbergh, so gets a lot of those dramas. I mean, he was Oscar nominated for Hotel Rwanda. Is he good in that movie? I gave up halfway through because that is a boring movie, let me tell you. And it also plays like super fast and loose with history. Like that was in 2005 where like the internet isn't like as immediately checkable. So like historical movies just like straight up lie and make stuff up. And it's like, well, if you're gonna make stuff up, make an entertaining movie. Like all of these shitty drama movies that we had to watch in drama class because it's like the only rendering of the historical event that we can understand. And there's like five things that they get wrong. It like drives me nuts. The only movie or TV show to get that right in terms of playing with history like that was um, Chernobyl, a masterpiece, where it's like, well, it's ridiculous because that helicopter didn't fall and fly over 3 days afterward. It happened a month late, but it happened. So you can like move it around. That's okay. And then it's like, well, it's ridiculous because the guy asking the guy to go under and dig a hole and be miners, he wasn't some corporate suit. He was like an actual miner himself. Yeah, but then we wouldn't get that scene where the guy's wearing the brilliant white suit and all the miners are like, we'll dig your graves for you and pat him on the back. And you have that cool visual of the guy being patted with the white suit on, covered in dust, you know, the sins of the people he sent off to die. Like, that's a cool scene. You can do that if it looks cool, but just being lazy and being like, yeah, we didn't check and we did this thing. Like, that's why I won't watch Hotel Rwanda because it's a bad. He's a good actor. So, yeah, Terrence Howard was screwed and he had bad agents. And as a result, he like got kicked out of the Marvel universe and kind of was in a downward spiral. Do not check the Wikipedia personal life section of Terrence Howard, let me tell you. But then, you know, he's talented enough that he ends up starring on Empire, which is a big hit for Fox. Probably got screwed out of that too, who knows? But, you know, he was decent at the time. He's just, you know, has a big ego. And a lot of actors who have a big ego too, sometimes they're bitter and they let that get the better of them. But, you know, what worked out for Robert Downey Jr. Um, ended up not working out well for Terrence Howard. Is that because Terrence Howard is secretly an a hole? Or is it systemic racism? In a Marvel movie? You decide. Um, Somebody who I like using as an example of contracts, and you've spoken about this too, is Channing Tatum, who's now totally in control of his career. He was able to steal a role away from Chris Evans to play like an astronaut in Fly Me to the Moon, I believe it's called, which throws me off because an animated crappy movie that I'll never watch called Fly Me to the Moon 3D came out that nobody saw, but that had that title and used it first. So this upcoming movie with Scarlett Johansson, with Channing Tatum as an astronaut, about them getting a crew together to pull off the biggest lie Hollywood has ever seen and make a fake moon landing in case they don't actually make it to the moon, which I can tell you now is going to end with the tape like being destroyed and them having to use the actual footage. And thank God, American ingenuity, and nobody will ever knew about the shitty movie we made. You know, joke about Stanley Kubrick. You know. Anyway, I shouldn't bash. I haven't seen it yet. It's written by Rose Gilroy. The fact that she was able to conjure a $200 million budget for this movie because A, it's an Apple movie, so they have no idea what constitutes quality because they're just a bunch of computer brains who don't have a single creative bone in their body. So they are like, well, it's Scarlett Johansson, Channing Tatum, you know, Rose Gilroy. Have to mention daughter of the talented Rene Russo and the talented Dan Gilroy, who wrote Nightcrawler. Um, Rene Russo, who started Nightcrawler. Rene Russo, great 90s career, like Lethal Weapon, Ransom. Then she was also, you know, Freya, in who clutch moment in Avengers Endgame is actually able to do something. She's the one who recognizes Thor and like has a real moment of, oh wow, like I'll just set it up for you. Avengers Endgame, a time when Disney basically poured every single resource of their $1 billion they had into this movie, knowing it was going to make them a huge amount of money. Basically, made a time travel movie where they could play you through Marvel's greatest hits of it snaking through its own history. And basically, in order to do that, you have to set up an arc for like Captain America and Thor and Iron Man. And they have to do that at the expense of expediency. So with time travel, you can just literally travel to moments in time where character development is supposed to happen and it's supposed to work, at least when it's done well in terms of plot. And Renee Russo, who plays Thor's mother, has basically been in a thankless background role ever since she was cast in the role in 2011. 8 years have gone by. It's like she's in the other movies. Apparently, she died in one of the Thor movies. I didn't notice, and I've seen them. Because I'm like, why is Renee Russo not in it anymore? Anyways, what happens in Avengers Endgame is interesting because Thor fails. He fails to save the world, so they have to avenge it, and they go back in time. And when they go back in time, they have to stop and get one of the Infinity Stones, and one of them is in Thor's homeland. And he goes there, and he's not the same Thor. Like, he's traveling back in time, so he has to pretend who he was at a moment in time. He's way heavier. And it should fall apart because immediately the Freya, the witch, whoever, it doesn't even matter that she is a witch and has all-seeing eyes and whatnot, can see beyond the horizons of time. They should be able to see, like, immediately that Thor is not Thor. And, he's the fat version of Thor. So, like, hey, call the guards, this is an imposter, blah, blah, blah. But because Renee Russo handles it well, and Chris Hemsworth, too, handles it well, it's they kind of have an emotional moment where Thor, who's already feeling imposter syndrome for not being able to save the world, has to confront his mother, who's raised him this whole life. And the way Renee Russo plays it, again, this is a character who's done nothing the entire 8 years she's been on screen in various Thor movies. And she kind of looks at him and he kind of gives this, like, terrible fib of, like, oh, I was just, playing with Loki or whatever, and this other thing. And she manages to play a character for, like, the one moment and is like, son, I've seen you raised up. I know when you're lying. You are not the Thor that I raised. But I'm not freaked out because I can see beyond time that something more important is going on here. Um, don't ever doubt yourself. You're worthy. It's kind of like a proud parent or something like that cheering their kid up. And it's a really, like, nice moment. And Gwyneth Paltrow has another moment where she kind of, like, nails it. But I just love those moments in movies when an actor who kind of, like, doesn't have the material to support them comes in clutch, and Renee Russo does. So hopefully her kid in real life, Rose Gilroy, and Dan Gilroy, you've probably seen Nightcrawler. I'm trying to think, and Roman J. Israel Esquire, another decent movie that guy wrote and directed. Hopefully there's a decent movie in there, but it just looks like generic trash, like Argyle, of, like, this movie could have been made 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's harkening back to this old, forgotten George Clooney style of, era of movie star, which didn't exist, by the way. Like, George Clooney actually did not become a movie star until Ocean's 11, and the only thing that uses his movie star qualities well are Ocean's 11, and he and Up in the Air, which is also, like, a good movie, and then he happened to star in The Descendants, which is a good movie that could have starred someone else. But George Clooney is more of a persona, but people look at him, a photo of him, a guy who's always looked old, and think of Cary Grant from, like, the 50s, and think, like, yeah, George Clooney, the last movie star and stuff. In terms of, like, when you think of a movie star from the 50s, you weirdly think of George Clooney as, like, graying, older, handsome man who's, like, kind of suave and debonair and effortless and that kind of thing. Um, this movie, Fly Me to the Moon, harkens back to, like, it's just funny to me because it, like, reads to me as phony. Like, the person who's making this movie is younger than me. So they're going from a dream within a dream of something that didn't exist. It's the reason that a movie like First Man, which was about the first man landing on the moon, didn't land. Why? Because when you watch a movie made by actual boomers who lived through historical time, and people give boomers a lot of shit, but they make good movies. Why? Because they have an emotional authenticity to them. You watch A League of Their Own, and it's not the greatest movie in my opinion. But like just the way all of the characters behave, like Rosie O'Donnell or Gina Davis or even Tom Hanks, where it's like these are all playing characters who have like problematic qualities, but they're like real problems. Problems that like make them feel like real characters. When you watch those movies, like watch one of Ron Howard's, watch Apollo 13, you know, watch a Spielberg film, watch, Catch Me If You Can. Um, I'm trying to think of a better one, but anything from like Rob Reiner, and you'll watch a movie and you're like, oh, like these directors, they saw JFK on TV when they were young. They saw the moon landing. They believe it. Like they believe their own and what many people would say today bullshit. But like, Forrest Gump is another good example of like we were around during that era. We understand, and they communicate that effortlessly. First Man was made by Damien Chazelle, who's a few years older than me, and stars Ryan Gosling. Brilliantly put together movie. Does not have an idea of what it was actually like during by that time. And you can tell when it's making that, like, as skillfully crafted as that movie is, amazing musical score. Production design by Nathan Crowley, who works for Christopher Nolan. All this good stuff, exquisite period detail. I watch it. My dad doesn't like he's doesn't evoke the feelings of that era. He looks at it. He's like, "Yeah, I saw that. I don't need to see this." And that's the thing of like, Fly Me to the Moon lacks that authenticity. So, um, who would have been good in the main role instead of Channing Tatum is Chris Evans, who I think of more of as an astronaut than Channing Tatum. Like, I sort of get it with Channing Tatum, but I totally get it with Chris Evans. But nonetheless, Channing Tatum in control of his career now, beats Chris Evans to making this movie. This is all rumor, of course. We may never know, but nonetheless. By the way, doesn't it just make sense for Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson, who have wonderful chemistry as like friends, to like go and make that movie? But I get it. So it's a $200 million Apple movie, written and directed by somebody who is younger than me and has like no experience. Ain't Hollywood grand. And you know what? I'm rooting for it to be great. But not great in a fake way of people like, go and see this movie and support this movie, or, oh, it reminds you of a time when movies were good. It's like, but is the movie itself good? That's all I care about. But Channing Tatum has come a long way. He broke out in Coach Carter, came out early 2000s film, January, wasn't expected to do well. MTV Films, they pander to like the urban audience and their marketing. It does well. It's one of Samuel L. Jackson's like few leading roles. Samuel L. Jackson does a lot of like supporting work. He's like in every movie. He's like, I don't care if he just stars in as many movies as possible. And he shows up, he does his thing, he knows his lines and that. But every once in a while, he'll do a main role and he'll show up and be very good. And that was Coach Carter. Comes out in January, decent, really solid hit. And they look at Channing Tatum and they say, hey, you're a star. Like, let's sign you to, a three-picture deal. And he's like, oh my gosh, like, can you imagine being a regular guy and being like, Paramount wants to sign you to like a 3-movie deal? Like, awesome. Like, of course I want to work. Like, that guarantees work at some point. What they don't tell you is that when they go and they make a movie like G.I. Joe, Rise of the Cobra, which is terrible, and they show him the script and he's like, I'm not doing this. Like, this script is awful. Can I play Snake Eyes at least? They're like, no, you're not playing Snake Eyes. You're going to be the lead. Like, we are hanging this movie with a terrible script on you, and you are going to sell this movie. And it's not even a discussion. It's not um, you know, people with craftier lawyers like Ed Norton has done, or who in many ways amazingly does not give a fuck when it comes to movies. He was almost sued by Paramount and they forced him into doing the Italian Job, but like he dodged making that second or third movie for them for so long. And the way it works is this: they see you as a rising star, And they're like, you're a rising star. We're going to bet on you. And because we're going to bet on you, you're going to do us a favor and you're going to be in these three movies for what we're paying you now in Coach Carter, in the hopes that when you become way more expensive later on and draw way more crowds, we'll get you for a bargain as a show of good faith because we were loyal to you when you were coming out. So they bring him G.I. Joe Rise of the Cobra, a terrible film. Um, Although it came out in the summer of 2009, and I saw it at the drive-in with Transformers 2, which was a slog, let me tell you. Like an awful movie, which was a victim of the writer's strike last time. And they were writing on the go, and that movie was a mess. And, I like Michael Bay, but man, that movie was terrible. 3 is better. I'm not sure I'll watch it again, but it was like a Hasbro double feature for Paramount in 2009, and seeing GI Joe, which had at least a sense of fun, had me enjoy it. But picture this: you sign a deal, you're like, all right, I'm going to be a movie star, and then they come to you and they're like, okay, here's a shit movie which you're going to anchor for us, and he's like, it's not a good movie. Like, why are we making a bad movie here? Like, this is GI Joe. Like, we can make it good. We can make a fun action movie. And they're like, well, we've already chosen the start date. The locations are already chosen. We've hired a director who, did The Mummy, so it should be good. Um, yeah, so this is the movie. It's like, but the effects aren't going to be ready. The script isn't good. The movie's going to suck because the story isn't good. And then they're like, yeah, no, we can make it good by like marketing it. So it's like you're stuck doing that movie. And it's like, great. Imagine being like, and the thing is, the regular people don't know that. The regular people that shout to celebrities thinking that they are the characters that they are. It's a bizarre thing of like people who play villains will will come up to people on the street and like refuse to shake their hands or hate them personally. Like this was the lady who played Skylar in Breaking Bad. Like they hate her in real life. And it's like she's playing a character. She's a nice person. You have to be a nice person to be an actor in Hollywood, pretty much, unless you're super talented and get famous super early, which quite a few of them do, especially through TV. But like there are people who are just people, and because they play a role that like super well and play a bad guy, like Tony Goldwyn, who was the bad guy in Ghost and played the president of the United States on Scandal, like people don't like him because of the character that he played in a fictional story. So imagine those people are out in the world and it's like you're going to be the poster child of a terrible movie and that'll be your career. Like if a movie is bad, it's on you, and the actors don't have any control. Like they're not in the editing room, they're not directing. Like that's why so many actors become producers, because they want to like have more control. Like, and that's what a lot of them are doing. Like Sydney Sweeney produced Anyone But You, like because it's like if I'm gonna have so much at stake, if I'm gonna like show myself, do nudity a lot of the time, like I want to have some degree of control over my career. So that's why more actors are becoming more savvy and doing producer roles, or at least getting paid to do commercials and stuff. So yeah, he stars in that movie. It does okay, but he weathers it. He weathers the storm, and then he basically gets an offer to do 21 Jump Street, and he's always wanted to work with Jonah Hill. Doesn't fit his brand, and they say don't do it, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna fire you. He fires his agent, um, Channing Tatum, gets new representation, does 21 Jump Street, hit, does 22 Jump Street, hit. He does G.I. Joe 2, which got a new director. It's a hit. The problem is the script was so terrible they killed him off. But it stars The Rock, so he promotes like a mother effer. It's a hit. And then, Channing Tatum takes control of his career. But he, early on in the years, like, it was risky for him. Like, he fell into Step Up, which was like a nice hit. He smartly doesn't do the sequel. And it's like, you got to be crafty. You got to be crafty if you're going to survive in Hollywood and have discerning taste. So, contracts. One of my favorite Hollywood contracts is actually, it sounds so weird to say, like I'm some corporate asshole. One of my favorite Hollywood contracts is the Indiana Jones movies, because they stretch over for so many decades. And it's not super well known. That is the ins and outs and clauses of the contract, but it's basically this: Steven Spielberg makes Jaws, which was first seen as a disaster. We all know this by now, and ends up becoming the highest grossing movie of all time at 25. At 27 years of age, he makes his kind of personal movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a movie where, the first kind is physical evidence. Um, no, I get that wrong. It's like the first sign is, I don't even know. It's been a while since I saw the movie Fourth Kind, which actually explains it, what a close encounter is. It's like first kind is something. Second sign is like physical evidence. The third kind is contact. So it's like, yeah, first sign, physical evidence. Second sign is sighting. Third sign is contact. So, anyways, big hit. Nominated for Best Director, Best Screenplay. Doesn't win, but is a big hit. Then Spielberg is kind of like, I'm on top of the world. I'm 30. I can do anything. I'm gonna like throw it all in there, make a bigger movie. And so he makes 1941, which is like a flop. This is in around 1979, and yeah. So he's on the bit of the back ropes there, just because 1941, which I've seen lately, and it is not good. Steven Spielberg is a consummate professional, but one thing that he can't do is comedy. So, 1941 is a bad attempt at comedy with John Belushi about a bunch of people in a California town who believe they're being invaded by Japan or something like that. And it's just kind of a movie that goes nowhere very quickly and in all directions. So Steven Spielberg is on the back ropes there for the first and one of the only times in his career. At the age of 30. At the age, like, to put this in perspective, Damien Chazelle did Whiplash. It was his second movie. He did Guy and Madeline on a Park Bench. So Steven Spielberg did Sugarland Express and a bunch of TV, so that's comparable. Then he does Jaws. So then for his third movie, Damien Chazelle makes La La Land, becomes the youngest person ever at 32 to win Best Director. Top of the world. He makes First Man, decent film. And then he makes Babylon, which is flop, cost $80 to $100 million. Loses Paramount quite a bit of money, but it kind of weirdly doesn't matter because two reasons. Number one is that the guy who greenlit it gets fired, Jim Giannopoulos. And the movie on the internet, where people usually scorch bad takes and bad movies and write directors off, it gets kind of a bizarre, group of people who pull for that movie. So, like, the internet kind of takes care of the movie and being like, hey, remember how good Babylon is? And they show you two scenes. The first is the Voodoo Mama scene where it's like the party. And then the second scene is like just the end of the movie where it's just a random montage set to the exact same music. And in the 3 hours that movie goes on for, and I find it totally humorless, there is the best scene in that movie, which is the Tobey Maguire encounter, where he's like a gangster and they have to go down and get the alligator. Like, that's the most, like, where there's stakes, there's a goal, there's this, there's that, everything. Like, forget those two scenes where the camera lingers or shows you a bunch of, like, other movies. And then people are like, kind of don't get the montage at the end of that movie. That it's just like random, this is cinema. It's like, no, this is like important movies that like pushed forward the medium of cinema. So when the main character goes to the theater, he is opened up to the possibilities of what Hollywood has become from what it used to be, and he sees the future of cinema. That's what that's about, and that's why Avatar is there, because Avatar came out, changed the world for better and worse for like 3D and stuff and CGI and motion capture, and kind of made a weird culture of fandom who, by the way, like goes out, sees the movie, shuts up, doesn't talk about it, goes AWOL for 10 years, and then shows up and goes see the other movie. And I am one of those people, the Navi Nation, who did see that movie. But all these smarmy Babylon people were like, because there's a clip of Avatar in the montage for 2 seconds. They're like, it's the best movie featuring the Na'vi people. And it's like, F you. Like, your movie made no money. Like, the people who want to get into a culture war about a movie, it's ridiculous. But, like, Babylon is Damien Chazelle's 1941, basically. And Spielberg is looking for his comeback. Meanwhile, his best friend George Lucas had made American Graffiti, nominated for Best Director. He had made THX 1138 out of school, which is a movie starring Robert Duvall about him and sort of like another clone. It's similar to the movie The Island. Of course, The Island is more derivative of it. But these two clones escape a facility and they're kind of on their own, a bit of a love story, this, that, the other thing. Anyway, he does that, does American Graffiti, both well received. Then he makes Star Wars, huge film. And then he makes Empire Strikes Back, but he makes it as a producer and co-writer, or maybe he just writes the story and Lawrence Kasdan writes the screenplay. And the problem with that is that Irvin Kershner directed Empire Strikes Back, but George Lucas, being George Lucas, wants it to kind of be considered his thing. You know, people forget that George Lucas did not write, really, or he co-wrote but didn't fully write or direct Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, or Star Wars Episode 6, directed by Richard Marquand. He didn't write, he wasn't the main writer, nor did he direct Episodes 5 and 6. So he basically wrote and directed the first one, which was the first one, the only good one that he did, Star Wars in 1977, which, by the way, good for him, nominated for Best Original Screenplay, Best Director, Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor. You know, it was nominated. It won 8 Oscars, 2 special technical achievements, but like Star Wars winning Oscars is not something you think about. So that's a huge hit. But the problem is that for the sequel, Empire Strikes Back, he doesn't direct it. And he's part of the Directors Guild of America. And the Directors Guild has a rule where the director's name has to be on the opening credits of every movie. This is the rule at the time. And they allowed it for the original Star Wars because it opens with the Lucasfilm logo. And they're like, wow, that's George Lucas, so he's the director, so we'll allow it. For Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas said, I don't want any opening credits. I want to be right into the movie. And the Directors Guild of America said no, because like then Irvin Kershner won't get, you know, credit for it, and that's against the rules and stuff. George Lucas had to go, oh, I don't care, you know, I have a big and then the DGA, who responsibly is like, well, no, because then people won't know that Irvin Kershner directed it. They'll think it's just like you. And if we allow that to happen, then it will open up a can of worms where everybody thinks that, you know, you directed the movie, and then companies become, you know, more powerful and directors don't get authority. So that can't be allowed to happen. George is like, well, I think I'm going to do it my own way, and then leaves the Directors Guild. So one of the rules is when you're not a member of the Directors Guild, you can't get a director who's another member of the Directors Guild to direct your movie. So basically, he has to go and choose for the third movie, Return of the Jedi, originally called Revenge of the Jedi, but they realized, oh, Jedi do not seek revenge, so they changed the title like 6 weeks before release, because back then you could do that. People would kind of see it as a desperation move when people change their title weeks out, and it is. But anyways, George Lucas doing well, but the Star Wars 2 basically makes him a bit of a pariah. So Steven Spielberg originally was going to direct like Return of the Jedi or Empire Strikes Back, if you can believe that for a second. And he was also courting David Lynch to direct it. And David Lynch just, when he was asking David Lynch, do you want to direct? David Lynch had a giant ass headache. Like that, like just listening to George Lucas go on about this stuff. And David Lynch was like, I could not bear to understand what was going on, and it was pure misery. And it's funny because it's like David Lynch doing his dark poetry and everything like that. And then it's like you look at his career, and then it's like David Lynch, and then I decided to make Dune, which, by the way, he didn't have final cut over, so it completely eroded. I'm sure George probably would have given him a bit more rope than Dino De Laurentiis would have given him, the famous producer. Um, but there, nonetheless, George Lucas is having some problems, although doing quite well, and Steven Spielberg is having some problems and doing quite well. And they're like, well, we're friends. Why don't we work together? So they work together to come up with Indiana Jones because Steven Spielberg said to George Lucas, well, I've always wanted to direct a Bond film. But of course, the Bond people are classists. They only, until the last terrible movie that was 2021's No Time to Die, they would not allow an American or non-British director to do a James Bond movie. Yes, the Brits are nationalistic shits. Who would have known? So they come up with Indiana Jones, then just called Raiders of the Lost Ark. They ship it to every single studio. Every single studio except for Paramount passes on it. Fox, Universal turns it down. And it's kind of ridiculous, really. So they do this movie, and it becomes, at the time, like one of the highest grossing movies of all time, one of the top five. And Jaws had just happened, and Star Wars was number one. So it's like Jaws is number one. Picture this: Jaws becomes the number one movie of all time, and then Star Wars comes out 2 years later and becomes the number one movie of all time. And then Spielberg comes out with, Close Encounters, big hit, and then 1941, and it's a flop. And then George Lucas has a fight with the Directors Guild of America, and they are the ones who are turning around, and they go to their buddy Lawrence Kasdan, who, in addition to writing Empire Strikes Back, which people consider one of the best Star Wars movies and films of all time, they get him to write Raiders of the Lost Ark, and no studio, because Spielberg is directing it and did 1941, wants to touch it. It's just like you're radioactive after you make one bad film. Artists have the right to fail. So the movie comes out, Raiders of the Lost Ark, huge success, one of the biggest films of all time, and Paramount goes, okay, well, how about we do 4 sequels? We'll write you down for 4 sequels. Now, when you get somebody on the back ropes, you can, get them in. You can lock them in. So they sign a deal. Spielberg signs a deal for Lucasfilm, which is then George Lucas's company, to make, which controls the copyright to Indiana Jones, because Spielberg hasn't set up his own company yet, to make 4 sequels to Indiana Jones. And in what they interestingly do is they kind of bounce back and forth on it. So because Universal turned down Spielberg's last idea, they don't want to make that mistake again. They greenlit his next idea. His next idea is E.T. E.T. then becomes like the highest grossing movie of all time, ahead of Star Wars. Yes, it's hard to believe how big E.T. is, because I rewatched it and I don't like it that much. I never really did, but it's a sweet movie. Anyway, Star Wars gets released a bunch of times, re-released in 1997, and overtakes it shortly before Titanic comes, and then the rest. Avatar, Avengers, back and forth, Avatar again, and now it's still Avatar, actually. And then Avatar 2 is number 3, I kid you not, if we're going by worldwide releases, which, it's a global world we live in. But anyways, every few years, Spielberg comes back and does an Indiana Jones. So he does Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, after he does E.T. And then, he does in somewhere in between there. I'm trying to think. He does, at the end of the 80s, Empire of the Sun, a movie I don't like but is well respected. Does The Color Purple, another movie I don't like but is well respected. And by the way, is shockingly better than the remake, which Spielberg produced last year. Like, geez, how did they mess that up? Like, that could have been a whammy. Like, consider this. The Color Purple is a very black book about a black gay woman's perspective, and Spielberg directs it reasonably well. He's only in his mid to late 30s at the time. He's like, I want to get Oscar fare. I want to get that Best Director Oscar. So he's trying all of these movies. And one of the movies he ends up directing is Always, which is a remake of A Guy Named Joe about World War II plane fighters. He changes it to make it like a pair of, forest fighters who fly planes. And it is probably Spielberg's worst film. It has a nice appearance by Audrey Hepburn, and it's about a guy played by Richard Dreyfuss of Jaws and Close Encounters who dies, and his friend, he helps fall in love with his old girlfriend or something like that. It kind of is awkwardly plotted, and it's weird. People say the special effects are good. It's pre-CGI. It's not good at all. Arguably you could remake it again. But, as people said, Spielberg never figured out a reason to remake A Guy Named Joe. It's just that him and Richard Dreyfuss talked about making it a bunch of times. World War II movie. Imagine a kid, you're 12 years old, your favorite movie that you see is your favorite film for life. So what happens is you grow up, you watch a movie, and then you play with these toys, and then you become a director, and you can suddenly make these toys a reality. And then same thing, but you become a famous actor, and these two make that film about, flying planes, putting out fires and stuff, and it's kind of a flop. So what do? They make a third Indiana Jones. Because when you're down, you can always go back to a franchise. If properly managed, if properly watered, it's like a cactus. You can go back to a franchise. It's the most steady work in the movie industry possible. Of you can take risks because you can always go back for the sequel. And that's what Spielberg did. So, Temple of Doom was well received, but was considered too violent. It was so violent they invented the PG-13 rating for it. Spielberg went into the Motion Picture Association of America. He had so much pull that he was like, okay, I have this and Gremlins coming out. There's too big of a gap between PG and R. We need something in between. So they developed a system where you can say the F word one time, and you can have sexual content but no nudity, and violence but no blood. And that kind of led to, a subculture of violence and problems with sex that pervades in this culture today, but it worked for them at the time. So they go back and they make Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, and they fold it out like a trilogy. Now, this is 1987. It's well reviewed. Everybody's like, yay! Spielberg's in his late 30s, Harrison Ford's in his early 40s, and, the sun sets with that movie. That is probably, in my opinion, the best of the Indiana Jones movies, because I rewatched Raiders, and I'm like, yeah, there's some good scenes in this, but everything that I greatly thought about that movie is the one with Sean Connery, which does the same formula of Raiders of the Lost Ark, but better. So there are only 2 films in that contract, and, years go by, next decade, he makes Schindler's List, Best Picture, Best Director. He makes Best Director for Saving Private Ryan, and then he does his stint with Tom Cruise, and a few movies with Tom Hanks, and starting with Saving Private Ryan, and, Catch Me If You Can, and does his Tom Cruise movies, and then after... he blows up with Tom Cruise on War of the Worlds because Tom Cruise says his Scientology people after friends of Steven Spielberg. I can bring that up in a later episode. But after all that, Spielberg is like, well, I guess it's time for Indiana Jones because I need a guaranteed hit. And enough time has passed. And, you get wistful about things like that. And talks to George Lucas. And George Lucas is pushing so hard for Aliens to be in Indiana Jones. And Spielberg, quite understandably, understands that Aliens are not Indiana Jones. And he's like, they're based on adventure serials of the 30s that you watch at the theater where, a guy would, back when they cost a quarter to get like a Nickelodeon, you would see, a 5, 10, 15-minute serial of like a guy jumping on a horse, fighting Indians and stuff like that. And then he'd make a jump at the end of it, and you'd have to come back next week to see if he made it. Or radio serials, same thing. Or in comic books, the same thing. So that's where Indiana Jones has its basis, really. And, Saturday morning cartoons come from that and all of that. So anyways, it's like stuff from the 30s. And times have passed, and they're thinking about where would Indiana Jones be in his life right now. And he's like, well, if the earlier films were inspired by the 30s, maybe we should be inspired by the B movies of the 1950s, the sci-fi movies. And Spielberg is like, no, that's stupid. Everybody's like, George, that's a bad idea. And if you know the history of George Lucas, he has plenty of bad ideas that you're like, who in their right mind would think of this? Like, half the concepts in Star Wars are just plain stupid. But George doesn't think so, and he has $1 billion. So he wears Spielberg down, finally saying to him, George, Steven, I got it. I don't want to do aliens. And Spielberg's like, thank God. I'm so glad, George, you came around. What'd you come up with? He's like, okay, they're not aliens, but they're sort of like interdimensional beings. They kind of, they kind of are. He's like, what do they look like? And he's like, oh, where they're sort of little green men and stuff like that, and they fly around in a spaceship. He's like, so, George, you mean like aliens? And he's like, well, no, but it is like, well, what do they look like? He's like, well, they look like aliens. And it's like, oh, Spielberg's like, fine, fine. You want to do that? Fine. Like, movie's gonna be shit. I don't care, you know? So they decide to do aliens because Spielberg, being the G that he is, decides to put his friendship with George Lucas ahead of the quality of the movie. And you know what? Sometimes you gotta do that. And Spielberg kind of knew of like, it's going to be a hit anyways. And it was. And the problem with that movie, aside from the aliens flying away at the end, is just the overabundance of CGI that George Lucas insisted on. And Spielberg just gave in to George Lucas so much. Why? Because he was in a vulnerable position. So, like I talked about in contracts earlier with, Terrence Howard, when you get somebody in a vulnerable position, they do it. But what does it matter? Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is a hit. According to Edgar Wright, you can't put and the and of the in the same subtitle. It's just too much. And you know what? He was right. Results in a bad movie. Although I love so much of Steven's direction, the nuke in the fridge is like such a great scene just because it's like, how the heck is Indy going to get out of this one? And the plot is so absurd, and it's early enough in the film that you're like, okay, I guess I got to go with it. But that movie makes $795 million the year The Dark Knight comes out, and it played on nostalgia. And he knows at this point, because time has passed, and Spielberg is now in his, late 50s, early 60s, and, his time passes. So he gets more wistful. He makes Lincoln. He makes Tintin, which is a better Raiders uh, Indiana Jones movie than Indiana Jones 4. Like, seriously, The Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn is like drawing heavily from the Raiders of the Lost Ark playbook, but is better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, if you've seen The Adventures of Tintin. It's funny that, like, the TV show that we watched as kids is like that's the movie that Spielberg was obsessed with, that he wanted to do. Sorry, I'm drinking a plasmid cocktail. Like from BioShock. It tastes like medicine. It doesn't taste very good. No, it's some green hard seltzer, like some Arizona iced tea knockoff. Um, anyway, so Spielberg knows at this point that he is contracted to do at one point an Indiana Jones movie. And isn't it just insane? Because he signs with Paramount, okay? At the time, Paramount was owned by Golf and Western, the hotel company. So his promise is to a hotel company. The hotel company sells Paramount. The guy who was the head of Paramount gets fired. That person gets fired. That person gets, retired. That person, and it's like, who did he promise this to? And you know who he promised it to? A company. Corporations aren't people, but according to U.S. law, they are. So he still owes Paramount, even though everybody's changed, even though a lot of the people who he signed with back then are dead, because he was like 30. But because corporations are people and Hollywood is run on contracts, he owes Paramount another. It was Paramount another Indiana Jones movie. You can see in an interview on YouTube of him just driving around the Universal lot saying, like, yeah, in a couple of years we'll do an Indiana Jones 5, which I guess I'll direct at, like, some point. And the funny thing that happens is that George Lucas becomes so rich with the Star Wars movies and his prequels and his ties to merchandise becomes so large that he decides to sell it at a maximum to Bob Iger, who is then 5 years or so into his tenure as the head of Disney, and all he has done is just spent on acquisitions. So he buys Pixar right as Finding Nemo is coming out, and then he decides to buy Marvel out from under Paramount. And he right after he buys that, he uh, has dinner with George Lucas, and at this dinner, George Lucas says, "Well, I'd like to sell Lucasfilm to you," and he's like, "Well, how much?" Do you want for your company? Because it just has the rights to, in Bob Iger's mind, it's not an equal value because, people said Bob Iger was crazy for buying Marvel for $4 billion when it didn't have Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, or X-Men, which are the three most important Marvel groups and characters. Um, so he's like, why? The people were like, why would you buy for this? And he's like, well, they have over like 4,000 different types of IP. Like they have like over 4,000 characters with backstory. Like, why wouldn't you make something out of that? Like, you can just make those comic books and stuff. So the way that Bob Iger's mind works like that is just kind of crazy. And George Lucas is like, well, I want the Marvel deal. And uh, uh, Bob Iger is like, well, you can't because Lucasfilm isn't worth that much. And George Lucas is like, well, it's worth it to me. And like, this is like, while George Lucas goes to the bathroom, Bob Iger writes on a cocktail napkin of like, okay, if I do one Star Wars movie every 2 years, I can get out a trilogy and I can get like about $1 billion out of three. That's three. Maybe we can do a spin-off or a TV show or something like that. So he's like, okay, maybe I can just give it over the curve so that it's within spitting distance of the Marvel deal. Give him $4 billion. George Lucas is like, wow, think about it, And in his book, which I read, it's actually a great book, by the way, The Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, stories and tales of him running Disney. And it's tales of Bob Iger, basically telling the story of how he bought Pixar from Steve Jobs and he bought Lucasfilm and how he was buying 20th Century Fox and creating Disney Plus and stuff. It's just, and then his ride from like a guy who worked at like the gift shop and in TV at ABC and then ABC being bought and then just a ride up the corporate ladder. So it is the ride of a lifetime. It's like the story of a guy who basically trades his whole legacy to be the head of a company, and the sequel, which he should be writing about, is about that same guy who can't let it go when the company wants him gone. Should make for a hell of a book or a hell of a biopic one day because everybody's like watching what happens. I mean, the guy destroyed his marriage over it, but it's what men do. I mean, George Lucas lost his marriage making Star Wars. The thing is that the person he was married to was the editor of Star Wars who won an Oscar and largely shaped that movie into making Star Wars what it is. She deserves a lot of credit, but not to George because George, when he was having to pay alimony, decided that he didn't want to pay her residuals for the Star Wars movies. So if he changed it just a bit and released a new version, he wouldn't have to pay his wife alimony. So those crappy Star Wars special editions, which have like 3 minutes of useless footage and changes like, Han shooting, f- uh, not shooting first, and like the musical interludes and like random CGI and stuff in the special editions. That was serious. George Lucas will tell you, well, Han has changed and he's not a killer in this. That's just him believing his own bullshit. The truth is is that he wanted to make just enough changes necessary of minimal things so that he wouldn't have to pay his wife alimony. And that is why you cannot watch the original versions of Star Wars unless you go to the United States Library of Congress and book time to watch it on a film reel, because it was so important that it was elected as historic for historical preservation. So you can watch those original. That's the only place you can watch the originals. So George Lucas, is a billionaire because of this, and he's very greedy. And the funny thing is that Bob Iger knows this. And Bob Iger, by the way, in the 90s, when In Between Indiana Jones 3 and 4 was coming out, Young Indiana Jones Chronicles came out. And that was like a TV show, Saturday morning serial. Not many people know. I'm not even sure I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's available on Disney Plus, but it was like a weekly Young Indiana Jones series. And I thought it was some knockoff when I saw it. I didn't know that it would officially involve George Lucas, but it did. And Harrison Ford is even like in an episode, actually. And it did okay in the ratings, but they really trailed off. And what happened was Bob Iger was running the TV division of ABC at the time. And I kid you not, he doesn't say it explicitly, but you can tell he did the math and thought in his head of, if I give this terrible show, Young Indiana Adventures Chronicles, to George Lucas, if I give it another season, that will give me goodwill with George Lucas to the day in which I run Disney and buy his company. Like, that is what he's thinking. And he says it later on in his book of like, to his wife, of like, I knew I had to move to New York or to LA if I ever dreamed of running the company one day. And it like basically cost him his marriage. But George Lucas, probably understands in the same way. He divorced Marshall Lucas and, got remarried to another woman. I don't know her name. I know that she's black, but I can't remember much else about her. Anyway, so George Lucas and Bob Iger are having a conversation. And I kid you not that, the whole reason Bob Iger, when you ran the television division, extended the contract of Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is because he planned for this exact moment of buying his company one day. And he thinks to himself, I'll give him the $4 billion and I'll wait him out. Why am I going to wait him out? Because the option is in stock offerings. And on December 31st, the stock offering laws change, and he will make significantly less money due to the closing of a tax loophole. So he absolutely will accept this deal. And he's like, lo and behold, close to Christmas in December 2012, George Lucas decided to sell the Disney company control of the Star Wars and Indiana Jones property. And immediately they announced like a trilogy of new Star Wars movies. And to seal the deal, Bob Iger bought George Lucas's outlines for his idea for the Star Wars sequels, which they didn't end up following. He just bought them extra as like a guarantee to have him sell the company, and did not follow his plans for the sequel trilogy at all, because it had to do with something called the Wills, which was like the source of the Force at the center of the galaxy. And it was more like new stuff that was about children. And they just, Bob's a company man. So they just wanted to sell you IP and something that you already know and was familiar to audiences. So that's what ends up happening there. He sells the company, George Lucas, to Bob Iger. So with that, go the rights to Indiana Jones. And so you would think, well, that's weird. So not only does the distributor, Paramount Pictures, change, but George Lucas and Steven Spielberg signed a deal for like a fifth Indiana Jones movie that they promised to Paramount, but the property is now owned by Disney. So Disney's gonna be the one making the new Indiana Jones movie. So like, how does that work? So what happens is they end up making the movie, trying to get like a script into production, and it's like they get the guy who wrote number four, David Koepp, who's worked with Spielberg a lot, and like he does a draft, and then you know they get Lawrence Kasdan's son, who's a nepo baby and can't really write that well, to do another draft, and then so much time goes on. There's like turmoil, and then COVID happens, which is like just one of the perfect things to happen because it like drains a lot. It puts a strain on a lot of companies, and then the final Paramount CEO, Jim Giannopoulos, gets fired. Until 3 days ago when Bob Bakish got fired, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, um, Disney decides they're going to make the fifth Indiana Jones movie, even though the script really isn't ready. And Spielberg has enough pull, basically, after doing West Side Story for 20th Century Fox, because West Side Story is one of the holdover movies from the Disney buying out Fox. The Fox movie West Side Story comes out and flops, and then that's $100 million flop, even though it gets nominated for Best Picture and wins an Oscar for a supporting actress. And Spielberg, kind of in his clever way, as he's always done, because the thing about Spielberg is not only is he a super talented director, he's also like extremely, even going back to his like 20s and 30s, incredibly savvy businessman. Like, it is astonishing the number of like stories you'll hear, like the famous one being Back to the Future, where he shamed the head of Universal Pictures into changing his mind on the title of Back to the Future from Adventures of Pluto Spaceman to Back to the Future by just saying, "Oh, that's a stupid joke," suggesting to change it to that Pluto idea. Great laugh. And then they're like, he'll never bring it up again. And he didn't. Sid Sheinberg was too embarrassed. So it's like stories of that, of Spielberg just being like clever and cunning and working within the studio system. You always hear stories of like Zack Snyder having it out with the studio or directors fighting over creative differences. That's a failure of imagination. Like, a good director, if you're like Spielberg, works within the system and like releases their version, but figures out a way to get their way anyway, either through planning or cunning or encouragement or what have you. So it's Spielberg kind of being like, and this part is speculation mostly, but it's like, oh, West Side Story flopped, I guess I don't have it, so he's like, I'll produce the next Indiana Jones, but you guys, like, I owed those to Paramount anyway. You guys are making this movie. So Disney ends up paying Paramount an association fee just because the original contract was signed with Paramount. They pay them an undisclosed amount. Paramount has nothing to do with the Indiana Jones movies. And the contract that Spielberg signed in the 80s when he was in his mid-30s is fulfilled in his mid-70s, over 40 years later, to essentially no one, by him just kind of stepping aside creatively and muting himself. And the 50th Indiana Jones movie comes out. They get James Mangold to direct, he's a journeyman. A studio guy, did Ford versus Ferrari and Walk the Line and 3:10 to Yuma. And all great movies that flop in their third act. The one that kind of doesn't is Logan, and he also did The Wolverine, which belly flops in its third act. But like, he's reasonably stylish and competent, but like, none of his movies have a good third act in their script that is totally earned or doesn't fall apart. It's just he has too flimsy setup, and he doesn't have enough confidence in his style to get away with it. Like, I would say an example of that is Michael Bay, where a whole crap ton of stuff in Armageddon makes absolutely no sense, but it is so entertaining that you're like, well, I don't care, I'm having so much fun. The whole turn off your brain thing that like idiot The Rock movies try and do. It's like, oh, it's like your head it made by somebody whose head was hit with a rock, is like turn your brain off to him, because it's just like half conceived and stuff. No, the idea of like turning your brain off is I'm transported so much to another place, I'm not thinking about it. It's not, this movie is stupid, don't think about it. It's, I'm transfixed. The style is out there. I'm so caught up in this world, I don't care about rules and logic. So a lot of stuff in Michael Bay movies is like that. Even in Zack Snyder movies, everything is so stylish, but and outlandish, but it's consistent in that. Like it's consistent that King Leonidas would throw a spear 50 yards. Which, by the way, there's a funny thing. Zack Snyder, who directed 300, was like a bodybuilder, and that was Gerard Butler's breakout movie. And Gerard Butler is carrying the prop spear, which is heavy, and says to Zack Snyder, like, I can't throw this like that far. That's like a super far thing to do. It's impossible to do. And Zack Snyder picks it up. He's like, oh, no, it's not. Here it is. And then he takes the spear and like chucks it like an Olympic thrower. And Gerard Butler's like, oh, well, I guess I can't complain about that. And like, there's this that's the climax of 300 when King Leonidas tosses the spear, and it goes so perfectly in a straight line so far. And that's when you're at the most hype moment of that movie in 300, when Leonidas has the chance to take out Xerxes, and he throws the spear. Um, Incredible yardage. And in that, you're not thinking about how unrealistic the movie is, or as some people take it apart politically somehow and be like, oh, it's a rallying cry for the far right. What? It's like, whoa, everybody, the guy who's disabled in the movie is treated as like less than human. And so like, like that's when I say turn off your brain. Like you know, yeah. Zack Snyder movies love movies about armies. They fetishize guns and prioritize violence. Say, isn't this cool when super powerful people break things and hurt people? Um, but it looks cool, so shut up. Um, yeah, so it transports you to a world. So the funny thing for me is just that Mangold doesn't earn that, and Spielberg movies always have that kind of wonder kind, like, I'm in a world where aliens exist. I'm in a world where, a boy can be friends with an alien, or the world is ending and I believe it, or, Spielberg can make you believe anything. This guy is just kind of like an above average studio hand, and that shows in the direction of action in the Indiana Jones movies. So not only do you take that, but you take that with like a bad script, which he then took and rewrote with his two buddies, John Henry and Jez Butterworth. I'm not sure if they're brothers, which I presume they are, father and son. Anyway, they wrote Ford versus Ferrari with him, but they write their version of the story, and the studio just goes, okay, yeah, we don't care. They make it about time travel because that's the laziest, hackiest device that any fantasy can introduce. It's good when it works, but this movie just is kind of like they spend 2 acts trying to activate a dial, and the action is done indifferently. Like in Spielberg movies and Zack Snyder movies, they always put the camera in like an interesting place where you can like see the action, and it looks painterly. It looks good. It looks transfixing. You go ooh ah in some other way. James Mangold isn't capable of that. And so the movie comes out, and they have the foolish idea, even though it's just done by like a studio hand. They're like, well, it's like they make the mistake of thinking like, oh, well, this is just like an Indiana Jones movie. It's not like a thing that only Spielberg can do. And they have the John Williams score as well, and which is dope, by the way. That score was nominated for an Oscar. Let me tell you, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is a horrible film. They release it at Cannes. They think they have a winner on their hands, which I don't know why they think that, but anyway, they release it at Cannes, at the French, who are the hardest audience of people who will tear a film apart, and they particularly do not like American films. Although if they are made by enough of an outsider, yeah, they'll make exceptions to that. But like the most Hollywood of Hollywood films, that's like conventional to the bone, that's like more boring than National Treasure and twice as long, they tear it apart. Like it gets horrible reviews, and their plan was for it to get good reviews, and that fails. And they also brought the Pixar movie Elemental there. So what happens is they bring both of those movies, which were previously made by brands, directed by more acclaimed people, They get people who aren't as acclaimed to direct those movies, and those movies don't do well. They bring them to like the fanciest, most pretentious film festival in the world, and then the movie gets torn to shreds, and then they're still 1 month out from uh, these movies releasing. Meanwhile, they have rotten ratings on Rotten Tomatoes, and they're sitting on the shelf, and that bad buzz is growing. They're like, Elemental and Dial of Destiny suck. And so Disney is just kind of sitting there with no plan. Elemental comes out, opens to 29 million. It ends up lagging out because it's like a feel good movie and there are no rom coms out. And this is an animated rom com that's weirdly made for people my age, the generation that won't grow up. Um, and Dial of Destiny comes out like 2 weeks later. This movie costs like $300 million, opens to 60. And then like not a week later, Sound of Freedom comes in like a train, and like the the far right adopts this movie and like runs away with it, and it's like the movie Hollywood doesn't want you to see about how the secret pedophile ring that people are kidnapping. So the other thing is like the Sound of Freedom, a movie that costs like $15 million, has this campaign where it's like buy somebody a ticket and make them go see this film, and it works because it's like takes the Tom Cruise from Top Gun. Thank you for coming to my movie. I really want to support movies. Um, Kind of thing a step further, and it's like literally buy tickets for people. I don't care. You can spend $100, buy 10 tickets for random people, get people to see this movie, and if you go see it, there will be tickets waiting for you, and it will be free. But you know what? Like, it's so funny because Disney gets so mad at this because on opening day, this movie, which I kid you, I study movies. I run a film blog, for God's sakes. I did not know about The Sound of Freedom until like a week before it opened. And then all of a sudden, like with a roar, it beats Indiana Jones, which opened to 60 million a week ago. Expected to like sail through. This movie comes out of nowhere from a studio which has barely released a movie before and goes up against the biggest studio in the world and beats it number one at the box office with like no promotion. And Disney is so friggin' pissed because they just had Elemental, which at this stage was still a bomb. They had Ant-Man from earlier this year, bomb. They don't want a third bomb in a row. This is Indiana Jones. It costs $300 million. It's bombing, and uh, it's like meanwhile the movie theaters don't care because it's the same money to them. Like people are buying tickets for them. Like, so the movie theaters don't care, like, who buys the tickets. The studios care because their movie's not number one. They look like idiots who can't make a good movie, which is true. So the Indiana Jones movie loses a significant amount of money. According to their balance sheet, they say they only lost 140 million. Of course, they're not counting the 100 million they paid themselves to release it on Disney Plus, which is just a way of moving around money so that they can basically use the streaming service, which is projected as a loss leader, to basically drive the price up of like, well, we paid $100 million for our own movie. That's how much we believe in our service. So when you put your movie on our service, that it has value. And so there's no way that movie didn't lose $250 million, at least, because it cost 300 million and made like 170, and then like something like 298 million. Like it, to give you an example of how much money Indiana Jones lost, what is it made less money than Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade did in 1987. So 87, 97, 2007, 2017, 2022. It made less opening with the full force of the most powerful movie studio in the world. Uh, it made less with that than a movie that opened 35 years ago, unadjusted for inflation. unadjusted. So when tickets were, you know, $3 to $5, uh, didn't that movie made more money than a movie when tickets cost $15 or 10 or 11, $12 on average. I'm going to see Fall Guy, and stupidly, because I have to pay for everything online, those tickets cost they're like $9.30 plus $1.50 in a convenience fee, whatever the f that means. It's such BS. We're being ripped off. Don't ask me to save theaters. So why did this happen? Well, it's because somebody at Paramount paid Spielberg money to make 4 Indiana Jones sequels. And it was essentially a movie that was forced to happen. And you can't force a movie to happen, like through inertia. Even if you're the most powerful company on earth, somebody has to want to make it. Or else it's not going to be a good movie because nobody believes in it. Like, there are movies, and Spielberg's done a few of them. I mean, I'd say Killers of the Flower Moon, even. But, people were passionate about making that movie because they thought it was important. But I'm trying to think of a few other movies where it's just, you can tell they have the most impressive people on earth, the best artists in the world, making a movie. And if they don't believe in it, then it won't make any money. I mean, now I like White House Down. It was a flop. You know what movie did do well that had the exact same premise? Olympus Has Fallen. And that movie cost half as much as White House Down. And it made more money because it's like you watch it and Gerard Butler is having a ball. And that movie, like, is R-rated. Spawned 2 sequels, the third of which is actually good. And, you know, it's like Antoine Fuqua directed it. The CGI is awful. CGI is kind of awful in both movies, but, like, more awful in the, like, I'm pretty sure that Olympus Has Fallen is a Lionsgate film, if I'm not mistaken, or Overture Films. Let me double check. Overture Films, by the way, was a small independent label. So Olympus Has Fallen was released by Film District, which got absorbed into Universal. So it was a small label at the time. So it was essentially like an independent film. That guy's got to be, yeah, I was going to say. I freaked out because, like, the cinematographer on Olympus Has Fallen was Conrad W. Hall. I'm like, the guy who shot Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Which happens. Like, good example is the person who edited Lawrence of Arabia, one of the greatest films of all time, is also the editor of 50 Shades of Grey and V Coats. And you look, if you want to have a little fun, look at any movie that's coming out, like, on any given weekend that you've heard about, like a major Hollywood movie opening. Even if it's like something like The Fall Guy, I'll do it here just for fun. I'm not sure what I'll find here because I know most of it. And you go into the crafts section, okay? Like, these are the below the line people who you wouldn't look up. And you look up names that you've never heard of, and you look at the resume of the movies that they've worked on in the past. And they've worked on, like, some of the best movies in the world, or some bad movies where you're like, oh, but the costumes were, like, incredible. Like, okay, I'll just look at the cinematography. They probably won't be that impressive. So the guy who did the cinematography for this did the cinematography of Deadpool, Bullet Train, Max Payne, Lost City. Yeah, that tracks because that movie looks like crap, to be honest. But he also did Transformers the Last Night, so, like, and Atomic Blonde both look good. Again, same director. Limitless, John Wick, all of this makes sense. So that guy's like a relatively new guy. Still impressive body of work. Production design. I love looking at production design because they literally create worlds. He did the production design on Inglourious Bastards. You know, and my point is that, like, impressive stuff. Best people in Hollywood working. So that's your assignment. When you go in and look at something and see, oh, who's this person? Check. You'll be surprised what the thing, like, this person worked on Mad Max, the makeup artist. So yeah, just go check it out. Anyways, that about does it for the Film Gamer podcast. This was the episode. Was it 30? Have we gotten to 30 or are we at 29? Man, my memory is going. Film Gamer Podcast. Yeah, number 29, season 3, episode 22 on Hollywood contracts. If it is written, even if no one on the other end cares, LA Indiana Jones, or it becomes Channing Tatum's nightmare, sometimes you just gotta sign and follow through, or otherwise follow your agent, or you'll end up like Dennis Quaid. See you next time when I preview the what I thought of the Fall Guy. I'll give you a brief review of that, and I'll give you, what I'm anticipating if I haven't already for the summer releases, including video games. Take care.